And parents are tremendously resistant to their children being put on a distinct track at age 14. They want to keep their options open. And unless you're very, very careful, what happens with anything which is a technical track at age 14, and this is not just an English problem, is that it's actually seen as something for academic failures, and therefore 80% of parents are going, no way is my child going into that.
Now, for the last 80 years, there's been a pretty heated debate about shifting education models in Britain to emphasise technical training, and then there's been a counterattack saying no, actually academic achievement is more important. So as Andy Burnham opens up the door once again, saying he wants more children to have opportunities for technical education from the age of 14 onwards, with access to subjects such as manufacturing and AI and an apprenticeship handout, we want to ask whether this is going to work this time. So we thought we'd open up the archive, going all the way back to 1944, to look at moves to boost technical education in England. And joining me to look back at that is Professor Dame Alison Wolf, Baroness Wolf of Dulwich, a leading specialist in the relationship between education and the economy. Hello to you.
Hello.
I suppose we'd better go back to the post-war period and the 1944 Education Act, known as the Butler Education Act, a landmark piece of education with a framework for free secondary schooling, offering 3 types of secondary school: grammar, secondary modern and technical schools. Here's a Teach First explanation of that Butler Act.
One of the Act's most famous consequences was the tripartite system of state schooling. Grammar schools for the academically inclined, secondary technicals for the technically inclined, and secondary moderns for everyone else. Overall, the Butler Act was revolutionary for its time. Besides making secondary education free, it recommended a gradual increase of the school leaving age, introduced a more equitable funding system for schools, and brought in a new process for setting teacher salaries. It made local education authorities responsible for school meals and milk. It opened up secondary school to more girls and more children from poorer families. And it tripled the number of children attending higher education. And it turned the Board of Education into a ministry, making Butler the UK's first Minister of Education.
But, Alison Wolf, what happened was rather that the technical schools sort of withered on the vine, didn't they?
They didn't exactly wither on the vine. They were closed down by Treasury that thought they were too expensive. The Butler Act, particularly this tripartite idea, came in for a huge amount of criticism later because it was seen, quite rightly, as putting people into categories at a very early age. But actually the technical schools or technical grammar schools were probably one of the best things that could have happened and remained, because they were a properly financed, high prestige technical option. They were very much seen as, and they really were, highly selective, but they had a genuine science technical content. And as I said, the Treasury in the end decided they were too expensive.
And a major reform then came in 1964 with the creation of industrial training boards funded by levy on employers in a bid to tackle a skills shortage. The industry was made responsible for vocational training and apprenticeships, and that was largely successful at the time. It saw an expansion of male school leavers entering formal apprenticeships to a peak of 43%, or almost half, and it led to more job training and day release from colleges for manufacturing sectors. So in other words, the burden was shifted from the taxpayer in technical education back onto employers, and it worked. Or not?
We'd always had apprenticeships. Let's be really clear about this. Employers had apprenticeships, and they had put the money into them and trained a very large number of people before that act. But yes, this was a realization that the numbers weren't enough, the amount of money going in wasn't enough, and there was this growing worry about the British economy. And therefore, this was a way of actually forcing businesses to pay into a fund from which they would then get money back for training. Was it successful? It was moderately successful. We still have the Construction Industry Training Board, which is really critical to our having any skilled construction workers at all. But it became phenomenally unpopular with employers because it became extremely bureaucratic. And there was always a worry that all the money went to large companies, not small companies. But interestingly, although it was then removed later, it's pretty much the same idea as something we've come back to with the apprenticeship levy, though we've sort of messed that one up too.
Yeah, I was going to say, because Margaret Thatcher, she actually closed a lot of these ITBs, industrial training boards.
She did it because she was lobbied very, very heavily by industry, hugely heavily by industry, who thought that this was expensive, bureaucratic, inefficient. And they had a point, but as so often in the history of technical education in this country, it would have been far better to reform, and instead what they did was just abolish.
Yeah, and instead what she did was she introduced the youth training scheme, the YTS, with 2 million young people provided.
And again, that will be all too familiar to people today because it was in response to a huge increase in youth unemployment. If you look up Hansard, there's all this incredible rhetoric about how it's going to revolutionize training. It didn't. It was an emergency scheme for young people who were on the dole. I think it's important to say that Mrs. Thatcher, like every other prime minister since, was worried about skills, worried about training. And YTS, I think, was not something that she saw as central to the future of the economy of the country. It was much more about what do we do about NEETs. But she did do other stuff, which you're probably coming to.
She also introduced national vocational qualifications in 1986 and a technical and vocational education initiative funding schools to bring technical, technological and business education in for 14 to 18-year-olds, including mandatory 1 to 2 week work placements, which have remained standard in schools to this day. Here she is speaking in 1985 on the need for more engineers and training, the idea behind NVQs.
I am always told that we haven't solved the problem yet. Wherever I go, we need more electronic engineers, more mechanical engineers, more civil engineers, and particularly those who have an entrepreneurial spirit, who actually want to go and work in industry, who actually want to go and work on creating some of the great projects which are so much a feature of our modern life.
And one of her key ministers, the educational reformer Ken Baker, he came up with the idea of creating modern technical colleges.
We met and we decided the one thing that was missing from English education was technical colleges. Now, we used to have them. And so Ron and I said, we must reinvent these, but they must be better than the old technical college. They're better in three regards. First, we get a university to sponsor each one. We want a university to get behind it. We don't want their money, we want their physical commitment to help pupil teacher and pupil mentor 14, 15, 16-year-olds, introduce them to campus life, introduce them to a much higher level, sophisticated level of education they otherwise have.
But Alison Wolf, here we are today, so those measures introduced by a Conservative government, they obviously didn't really work.
Well, Ken Baker's UTCs are still with us, but they haven't grown in the way that he thought they would. He thought they would be an absolutely huge, huge success. But I think the thing that he and I'm afraid probably Andy Burnham are ignoring is that, for better or worse, we're in a very different world. We're now in a world where, in fact, almost half the cohort everywhere in the developed world, if not more, go to university. And parents are tremendously resistant to their children being put on a distinct track at age 14. They want to keep their options open. And unless you're very, very careful, what happens with anything which is a technical track at age 14, and this is not just an English problem, is that it's actually seen as something for academic failures, and therefore 80% of parents are going, no way is my child going into that. I do think that, in a sense, those two clips you've played are interesting, because what Mrs. Thatcher was pointing to was a shortage of very high-skilled engineers. And Ken Baker's answer has always been that there should be a track at 14 onto which people go, which seems to be Andy Burnham's. Now, that actually worked quite well with the technical grammar schools, which are highly selective. But it's been really hard in any country, even those that had long established and stable vocational schools, for them to maintain their attractiveness in a world of mass higher education. People want their kids to have their options open. And I would also say that the most important vocational qualifications you can have in modern England are English and maths.
Yeah, which are academic subjects. I mean, John Major tried to create so-called higher tier qualifications, technical qualifications. But then with the arrival of the new Labour government, Tony Blair and his education secretary really changed the emphasis, didn't they? I mean, they went to the idea of academic achievement being most important, English and maths, as you say, Alison. And, of course, that ended up with the idea of 50% of people going to university, which was including the technical centre in the academic structure. Here, courtesy of AP, is Tony Blair's most famous education quote, actually made before he became Prime Minister at the Blackpool Labour Conference in 1996.
Ask me my three main priorities for government, and I tell you, education, education, and education.
Now, that was part of Tony Blair and David Blunkett's idea of a new deal for young people, focusing on welfare to work under a merged education and employment department, which they hope would get people into training, education and employment, with the aim, the arbitrary target of over 50%, more than half of school leavers going to university. Where did that leave technical education, Alison?
Well, basically nowhere very much, although they kept tinkering with it because everybody keeps tinkering with it. And, you can't be Prime Minister or an Education Secretary, it seems, without getting up and making a speech about parity of esteem between technical and academic. But the reality is that what this did was it focused attention on expanding the universities. And again, I do want to emphasize that this was not a freakish whim on Tony Blair's part. This is something which has happened in every developed country. And in every developed country, we're now finding that a lot of people go to university and then find that their degree does not bring them what it used to. But what it did do, I think, was it did mean that there wasn't that much, not just that much attention, but that much money going into the main home of technical provision, which is the further education colleges. And they were funded more generously under Labour than they were in the later austerity years or since. But there is no question that once you have this huge university sector, it swallows up attention, it swallows up cash, and it means that it's the obvious destination for young people. And that's what happened in this country in the first 2 decades of this century.
And then in 2011, obviously the Conservative government was in power following the 2010 election. And you were actually called in by David Cameron to commission a review of vocational education. What did you conclude?
Well, this was a very special problem, actually, and I think it only arose because everybody was paying lip service to vocational. The thing that I came in and sort of hopefully fixed was two very, very bad and unintended policy developments that had occurred. The first was that they had decided to make any low-level vocational qualification equivalent to a GCSE for school league table purposes. And so what you had was schools putting 14 and 15-year-olds not into GCSEs, but into, as I said, low-level quasi-vocational qualifications for which they got full credit, but which did those kids absolutely no use at all. I mean, they were completely irrelevant to their future job prospects. They weren't things that employers recognized or valued. And so you had these kids being told that they had got 10 GCSE equivalents, and actually they'd got nothing of value. So the first thing that I recommended was that we sort that out. That was not the same as saying there should be no technical GCSEs. It was saying that you couldn't just have hundreds and hundreds of low quality, irrelevant qualifications being offered to young people and counting in school league tables. The other thing that they had done, which was also very weird in retrospect, was that for 16 to 19-year-olds, they'd started to pay sixth forms and colleges on a per qualification basis, which is not how we operate now. You have a chunk of money to educate a pupil. And so again, what was happening was that you had what a friend of mine called fat students and thin students. Thin students didn't bring in much money, but you could just about get them through 2 or 3 things. Fat students were really good. You could put them in for loads and loads of qualifications, again, many of them pointless, and it brought in more money. And that was the other thing, and we changed that. And I have no regrets about either of those, because they were unintended consequences of an ill thought through desire to show that people valued technical qualifications without actually thinking about what those qualifications might be.
And as you say, as a result, the Cameron government abolished some 3,000 vocational qualifications and tried to bring in standards for apprenticeships to avoid the tick box criticism of MVQs. Then subsequently, Theresa May had another review, the Sainsbury Review, and she proposed a restructuring of technical options into 15 different routes, including T levels and technical E levels. And Boris Johnson then expanded this idea with a so-called lifetime skills guarantee.
I can announce today that we will be expanding apprenticeships, reforming the system so that unspent funds can be used more easily to support apprenticeships, not just in big companies, but in the SMEs, where there's so much potential for job creation. And we want many more of these apprenticeships to be portable, so you can take them from company to company. Suppose you're in a small startup making videos for YouTube, and the project ends, so you've got to move to another such small company. Under our plans, you'll be able to take that apprenticeship to your new employer, and it won't die with the end of the contract. But if we're going to reform our post-18 education, we must go much further. We cannot save every job, but what we can do is give people the skills to find and create new and better jobs.
And then Rishi Sunak went on to propose an advanced British standard, a total scrapping of A and T levels, merging them into one. Labour dropped that when they came into office. And now we have Andy Burnham, the new Prime Minister. He says bringing in a model which will see employer-led pathways beginning age 14 in year 10, so that vocational qualifications are valued at the same level as academic ones. Here's Andy Burnham in one of his social media appearances.
For decades, young people have been told that this leads to success and this doesn't. I'm not having that. I want an education system based on parity between academic and technical. In a fundamental change to the system, I'm announcing new routes for 14-year-olds to get early access to technical education, skills training, work experience, and connections with employers, giving them the knowledge and experience they need to get quality, well-paid jobs where they live. This is just the start of our work to restore opportunity and hope across the country.
Well, in his own style, Alison Wolf, but it has to be said, we've heard a lot of this from Prime Ministers of both colours, haven't we?
We have indeed. I'm beginning to think that you can't be Prime Minister if you don't get up and announce parity of esteem. It's obviously in the job description. Couple of things about those clips. First of all, full disclosure, I was an advisor to the Johnson government on skills, and I agree with some of what Boris said there. I do think apprenticeships are hugely, hugely important. And I do also think that for adults, we have a real problem with a lack of joined up provision. But going back to technical education in schools, the problem is that 14 is not an age at which in the modern world most people want to, or their parents want them to, make firm decisions. And the other thing goes right back to the technical grammar schools, which is that good technical education is expensive and it has to be taught by specialists. And most secondary schools are currently extremely strapped for cash, and they do not have on their books experts in technical subjects. And so there is a real risk when you do this that you end up going backwards and recreating qualifications and pathways which pretend to be high skill, high reward, and actually all too quickly just become something where parents go, well, if he's in that stream, it means he's not doing very well. If she's in that stream, it means that the school has given up on her. And I do worry a great deal about that.
Okay, sobering stuff. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Alison Wolf, there, for joining us here on Times Radio to look at efforts to improve technical education in this country.